Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. One of the great benefits of a long history is that when things get tough in America, we can look back to see how we as a people and as a nation survived other trying experiences. The transformations of the Industrial Revolution at the turn of the last century put great strain on the country. McCarthyism in the 50s tried our political conscience, and the upheavals and social political transformations of the 60s shook the nation to its very roots. Riots, racism, political assassination, and long-seething anger all set the stage for the politics of 1968. A unique set of characters enlivened the political landscape. The question then, as I suppose it is today, is whether the politicians shaped the issues or the issues shaped and tested the politics. Journalist Michael Cohen, in his new book, American Maelstrom, makes the case that the election of 1968 tested the nation and may have in fact laid the predicate for where we are now 48 years later. It is my pleasure to welcome Michael Cohen here to Radio Who, What, Why.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. One of the things that I'm struck by, and maybe it's just the historical comparisons and history creates this mythology, but the cast of characters that surround the 1968 election is such an interesting and powerful cast compared to some of the folks that we're dealing with today.
Oh, I think, in honestly, there's no comparison. I think you're talking about the most influential political figures of the second half of the 20th century. Nixon, Reagan, Johnson, Wallace, Humphrey, Rockefeller. I mean, it's sort of a fascinating group. And I think one of the things that makes 68 such a fascinating election is that you have so many figures who had such enormous influence in American politics, all involved in this one campaign. It's pretty unprecedented for American history.
And I suppose the question is that when we look at what happened in 1968, and we'll talk much more about that, whether or not the events that happened, the changes in our politics, the realignment in our politics, the way it changed as a result of 1968, is in part responsible for the decline in the quality of leaders we have since 1968.
Well, that's a great question. It's sort of a tough one to answer. I mean, I think, the better way to, I think, for me to answer that question, the best way to answer that question is sort of say that I think that the impact of 68 was sort of to change the way we talk about politics, the way we think about politics, and really, inside the two parties. And so it created a bit more homogeneity in the parties on politics. And so one thing about 68 that's so fascinating is that, the general election was Nixon versus Humphrey versus Wallace. It's actually kind of a boring general election. The real action came in the primary, came in the convention fight. You had on the Republican side, you had Richard Nixon, but you had on the left Nelson Rockefeller and George Romney. On his right, you had Ronald Reagan. Among the Democrats, you had G. McCarthy, who attacked Johnson, who ran against Johnson basically over his opposition to the war in Vietnam. You had Bobby Kennedy, then you had Hubert Humphrey, one of the great liberals of the second half of the 20th century. So the drama is between the parties. The drama is between the candidates inside the parties. And I think now, there's so much homogeneity among the parties, or greater homogeneity, that I think, you don't have these distinct wings of a party like you used to have, particularly among Republicans, that used to have back then. And so I think maybe that contributes to some of the not political figures being less interesting, but maybe the drama within the party being less compelling than it was back then.
In many ways, though, it set the stage for some of the coalitions we see today. In fact, the modern Republican Party is arguably a combination of that kind of Richard Nixon silent majority plus the George Wallace coalition. The Democratic Party became the Robert Kennedy minority party plus the Nelson Rockefeller Wall Street part of the party.
Well, it's interesting about that. So when Kennedy ran in 68, one of the great myths of his campaign was that he had created this BlackBlue Coalition, which basically meant black voters and white blue-collar voters. That was not true in 68. He did not create that coalition. Blue-collar voters remained. Many did vote for Democrats, but many shifted to George Wallace or to the Republican Party, especially in the South. So in that sense, but 50 years later, you could sort of say that coalition that Kennedy was trying to create has sort of come true. You do have still have strong blue collar support among Democrats, particularly in the Northeast, between union members. you've got obviously the non-white wing of the party, which is non-white wing of the electorate, which is 80-90% supporting Democrats. And then what you were talking about, Nelson Rockefeller, the Wall Street wing, I would sort of talk about more as being sort of highly educated white liberals who this election seem to be leaning very heavily toward Hillary Clinton and are one of the more important groups for Democrats this year. So I think that, what's interesting about 68 is that these coalitions sort of emerged and they've evolved over the years in ways that I think were sort of unexpected. Particularly, I think, also among Republicans, too, because, Richard Nixon, in part, the whole Southern strategy began in 68, the whole idea of trying to win support in the South over civil rights, or opposition to civil rights. And now, in a sense, the Republican Party has become sort of controlled by its Southern wing. An incredible shift, considering that 50 years ago, the South was considered solidly Democratic.
Which goes to one of your points that it's impossible to understand 1968 without going back 4 years and really seeing what happened particularly in the Republican Party in 1964.
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting about 68 is that if you went back 4 years earlier, you saw Lyndon Johnson win the largest popular vote majority in American political history. I mean, just decimated Barry Goldwater. And everyone, it's Barry Goldwater, who was, the most conservative nominee the Republicans had in many years, certainly since the turn of the century. And everyone assumed, well, okay, so conservatives had their chance, they lost, now the moderates are going to come back. And it didn't happen. Nixon was certainly more moderate and more centrist than Rockefeller, than Goldwater, but he wasn't as liberal as someone like Rockefeller or George Romney. And in fact, I think he sort of straddled the two wings of the party, but certainly leaning, at least rhetorically, particularly more toward the right. And the result of it is that the moderate wing of the party kind of disappeared after 68, which I think nobody could have imagined happening after Goldwater's defeat in 64. And of course, the flip side of this is on the Democratic side. Lyndon Johnson wins the biggest victory in American political history, and he ends up not even being able to run for re-election. And the Democratic Party falls to 43% of the vote in the national election from about 61%, which is the biggest shift, I think, or one of the biggest shifts in American political history.
It's interesting that after 1964, after the Goldwater debacle, that people talked, as they tend to be talking now, about the end of the Republican Party, that it was not going to be able to survive the losses that it had in 1964.
I mean, and because it really seemed that way, because it wasn't just Goldwater that lost. I mean, the Republicans lost the House, they lost seats in the Senate, they lost state legislature seats. They just were destroyed. The difference, I think, is that Goldwater, for all of his failings as a politician, tapped into something that was going on in the country, which was the growing anxiety over civil rights legislation and what the cost of integration would be. And it's important to remember that Goldwater only won a few states, but except for his home state of Arizona, they were all in the Deep South. And that was fundamentally because of his opposition to civil rights. And so I think, one of the lessons that Nixon and other Republicans took away from that experience was that opposition to civil rights, or at least criticism of civil rights legislation, or at least a call for maybe slowing down civil rights legislation, was could be a very popular message for Republicans, particularly in the South. But it ended up being a message that resonated across the country, in large part because of what happened in the 4 years between 64 and 68. You had this extraordinary increase in crime. You had major riots in American cities, the most famous ones being in Newark and Detroit, and then the riots that came after the King assassination in 68. You had the war in Vietnam. You had sort of all of the dysfunction that was evident in the country in 68 with the two political assassinations. So in a sense, it wasn't just a question of the party, of the country adopting Goldwater's conservative message. It was really more a question of the country starting to feel like it was sort of falling apart a little bit. That was at least the sense a lot of Americans had, and that was a mess, and that helped the non-incumbent party with the Republicans.
Right. It was also clear that Goldwater had tapped into something which we saw in the Republican primaries in 1964, but that he was such a poor messenger of it, really. I mean, Ronald Reagan became the much better messenger of that later on.
Well, that's absolutely true, but it was also that Goldwater was very ideologically dogmatic. very strongly anti-communist, strongly anti-government in ways that were not appealing to a lot of voters. Talked about maybe making Social Security voluntary. That didn't work so well with a lot of voters. And so when Nixon ran in '68, he adopted some of the rhetoric, talking about law and order, talking about Vietnam, but he didn't dare talk about cutting Social Security. And he tried to present himself as a less hawkish figure than Goldwater. So it's absolutely true that Goldwater was maybe the worst messenger for conservatives they could have had. And what a lot of smart conservatives, like Reagan when he ran for governor in '66 California and won, like Nixon in '68, they figured out how to make Goldwater's message a little more appealing to a vast cross-section of Americans.
It's interesting because you see the Donald Trump message today, and in a way it harkens back to Goldwater because it's very dystopian, very dark, very negative, and you see that in such contrast to what Reagan brought later on in that period with conservatism with a sunnier disposition.
Right, and this is something interesting. I mean, it's funny you say that about Goldwater because you're absolutely right. There is this very dark worldview that Trump and Goldwater both have. But the big difference is that Goldwater was a real ideological conservative, and Trump is not. Right. Trump is very much, I'm not sure how to describe him properly, but he's not an ideological conservative. He doesn't talk about cutting taxes, not a big part of his message. Doesn't talk about cutting Social Security or Medicare. Doesn't really talk about cutting big government. It's much more of a populist nativism, which is more reminiscent of George Wallace, who ran in '68 also. And that's, I think, where the big sort of, takeaway from '68 as far as Republicans go is the impact someone like Wallace had. Because what he ran this very, racist, racially sort of tinged campaign, but very populist. And very much, this was somebody who's very much an old school sort of New Dealer. In fact, I see a lot of similarities between the kind of campaign that Trump is running, the populist campaign Trump is running, and the populist campaign that Wallace ran in '68.
Right, and that's really, to a large extent, as we were touching on before, what the Republican base has become is kind of a blending of both the Nixon and Wallace coalitions. They're not as strong today, number one, because of the demographics in terms of minorities around the country, and also the change in population shifting from the middle of the country to urban areas, and that move still continues. So it's shifted the demographics in ways that haven't helped Republicans, but essentially that Wallace-Nixon coalition is really what's been driving the Republican Party for the past 20 years.
Yes, absolutely. I would say since '68, what's driven the party is basically a white, nativist, populist message. One, I think, that is focused on economic anxiety, focused on racial anxiety, white resentment of the gains being made by non-whites. This was the message that came out of '68. Nixon didn't run on that directly in '68, but certainly afterwards in '72 he did, and every Republican basically up until pretty much today has run on that sort of that sort of focus on white voters and white resentment. And it worked for a long time. It worked for about 25 years for Republicans. It still works on the House and Senate. It doesn't work on the presidential level. And I think that's what you're seeing this time is that this idea that you can create this coalition of angry, resentful white voters, the demographics of the country don't support that anymore. When you 30% of the electorate that's non-white, you can't win on white votes alone, and that's the lesson I think that the Republicans are learning from Donald Trump. I think a lot of Republicans knew that, by the way, after losing 2012 and realizing that they had to find a way to win among Hispanic voters. But with Trump at the head of the ticket, they may lose that chance for quite a long time.
The Republicans had the answer. They did this. The Republican National Committee did this sort of after-action report that basically told them exactly what you just said.
Yep. This is not a surprise. They certainly understood after 2012 what they needed to do to win a national election again, and they've done the opposite. They've done the opposite on steroids. They've done the opposite in a way that has made it that much harder for them ever to win non-white voters. And, one of the things that's interesting about '68 is that this was actually, for the time, the most racially polarized election in American history. You had Democrats winning more than 90% of the black vote. And 8 years earlier, Richard Nixon won more than 30% of the black vote because many Republicans still voted many African Americans still voted for the Republican Party, and that ended after '68. And from '68 on, you've had a situation in which Democrats have basically always, with a couple exceptions here and there, dominated among black voters. I think the fear for Republicans they should really have is that the same situation could happen with Hispanic voters after Trump. Mm-hmm. I know you hear people say, well, Hispanic voters tend to be more conservative socially, and as they mentioned, middle class, but some more Republican. Perhaps, but it's hard to forget what's happened this election and what happened the previous couple elections and what's happened in the Congress with immigration reform and the rhetoric of calling Mexican immigrants rapists and murderers, as Trump has done. And I think there's a real risk here for Republicans. They don't just lose 9% of the black vote. They may end up losing 89% of the Hispanic vote, and not just this year, but for many years going forward. Once I think these voting patterns get established, it's very hard to break them.
Right.
And I think it's very possible that you could see a repeat of what happened in '68, in which this segment of the electorate basically decides the Democratic Party is better for our interests. We may not agree with them on every issue, but when it comes to sort of basic civil rights issues, they're the party looking out for us, not the Republicans.
This isn't a theoretical point. All one has to do is look at California
right.
and what's happened to the electorate here, particularly post Prop 87 and Pete Wilson. I mean, a Democrat can't get elected statewide in California, period.
No,
I mean, a
Republican.
Republican, yeah.
But you're absolutely right about that, and I couldn't agree with you more. California is the nightmare scenario for Republicans because of course, for 20 years now it's been the case where Republicans have been shut out in the state, and it's largely because of what you said, because of their position in '94, opposing measures that supported the Hispanic community, and I think, and basically demagoguing on immigration. I think that has really caused in California, and that could be something repeated nationwide. It wouldn't shock me at this point. I mean, by the way, you know this better than I do, California, but it used to be California was a state that was kind of up for grabs.
Right.
That candidates used to actually go to California, and it was a swing state maybe, but hasn't been in 20 years, I think.
One of the other aspects of this, and it sort of speaks to Nixon in '68 and kind of contrasting with what we're seeing from Trump now, is that Nixon did have a better understanding of the American experience, partly because of his own history and his own roots, but there was a deeper understanding that Nixon had of the American electorate and American history. That was not insignificant.
No, it's not, and it's a great point. And one of the things that I discovered when working on this book was just how impressed I was with Richard Nixon as a politician, because he really was a brilliant politician. He may have had a lot of issues as president, and may have had some issues with criminality, but he certainly was a good politician. And as you said, I mean, this is somebody who his father was an FDR Democrat, and somebody who came from great poverty. This was not somebody who was an ideological conservative. This was somebody who opposed, big government on principle. And as president, he expanded the welfare state, expanded the regulatory state, did all kinds of things that drove conservatives crazy. Now, part of this was politics. Part of this was because he had a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and so he had no choice but to, if he wanted to get anything done, he had to work with Democrats. But I think part of it also was just that, he did understand, I think, better than a lot of other Republicans, why things like Social Security and the safety net and mattered to people, and why that was something that Republicans had to tread softly if they were gonna mess with. And I think a lot of Republicans in the years since then have not understood that. I think Reagan understood also. Reagan was somebody who also came from a Democratic family, and very ideologically conservative, but somebody very pragmatic. And both he and Nixon were very pragmatic politicians. And what you've seen in the last 8 years, in the last 20 years, Republicans have become much more ideologically dogmatic, much less interested in compromise, and I think much less in touch with the voters. And I think you see that with Trump. You see the success of Trump is a direct reflection of the Republican Party that really has lost touch with its supporters, or more accurately, perhaps, taken voters for granted. And I think you're seeing the results of that this year.
The other part of it is the context of the times. We talk a lot about fear of terrorism, fear of crime now, but the dangers were far more real in 1968. There were bombings, there was political assassination, the crime rate was through the roof. I mean, there were real fears. The difference now is that all of that is more than significantly less, but it gets 24/7 coverage. And those two things are sort of an interesting contrast.
No, I think you're exactly right, and this is why I sort of get really annoyed with comparisons to '68, because I don't think people truly appreciate, what was happening in the country in '68. You had this extraordinary increase in crime rates. I mean, people talk about crime now; it's nothing like in '68, and this was something that went on for years, from basically the early '60s until about '68. You had 500,000 American troops fighting a war in Vietnam. You had two major political assassinations. 2 months apart. First, Martin Luther King, and then Bobby Kennedy, and that was only 5 years after, of course, John Kennedy had been slain in Dallas. So, and of course, I should also mention, I mean, after the King assassination, you had riots in dozens of American cities. This was the most sustained period of violence in America since the Civil War. So people were genuinely afraid, and they had legitimate reason to be fearful of crime, to be fearful of riots breaking out, to be fearful of their children perhaps being sent to Vietnam. It's a totally different period today. And I think one of the reasons people freak out today about some of this stuff is because I think they're not used to living in a period of such political instability. And so when we have these terrible incidents like we see in Dallas and Baton Rouge and St. Paul, I think people, respond so viscerally to it because we're not used to seeing this. And back in '68, people were much more, I think, desensitized to political violence and to political instability. I think today but of course I should say also that there's not really any evidence that sense of the country's falling apart is having a huge impact in politics. People still end up supporting the incumbent candidate in this election, Hillary Clinton, I think because they don't feel the same kind of fear and anxiety that people like Trump are talking about.
The other difference today is that when something like Dallas happens or Orlando happens on terrorism side, that it's front and center in our living room,
right,
24/7 for days and days and days. That's very different than 1968.
It is, but to keep in mind, in '68 you had three major, broadcast networks. And so, all your news came from the nightly news. If you turn on the nightly news at night, you would see pictures from Vietnam. You might hear the latest crime statistics. After the King assassination, you would have seen tons of pictures of riots. I mean, there was. I hear what you're saying, and I think there's a certain kind of lead the lead kind of attitude among the media today. But imagine if you were living in a society with three channels, and no internet, no cable, and you're getting all you turn the news on, all you see is terrible news stories of what's happening in American inner cities, but also in Vietnam.
The other thing that we haven't really touched on that changed dramatically in this period is a real fundamental shift, and it was post Lyndon Johnson, post Great Society, a real fundamental shift in what people saw as the legitimate role of government.
Yes, I think in many ways this is sort of the biggest change, although it's one that's a little bit deceiving, because I think, a lot of the rhetoric that you heard from Nixon, particularly from Wallace, was this sort of anti-government populism, this idea that the government was not looking out for the American people, that they were putting in place policies that were harming them, that they were out of touch, that they were elite. This was sort of the rhetoric of Wallace and ended up being adopted by a lot of Republicans. But the reality is that a lot of Americans bought into this notion, and a lot of Americans have sort of a, predisposition to view the federal government in sort of negative, cynical terms. But most Americans still liked a lot of what government did. Support for Social Security and Medicare and education and transportation, infrastructure spending, all of that didn't go down. It remained pretty strong. And so, what you had was this sort of situation in which, on the one hand, voters were saying we want smaller government, but we don't really want smaller government. I mean, we don't really want to see you cut Social Security and Medicare. We don't really want to see you, cut funding for schools. And so, but I think what ended up happening, a lot of politicians believed that they did want that. Especially Democrats. They kind of believed that voters were tired of big government. They were tired of big government solutions. And in a sense, Democrats got away from the economic message of economic justice that had long defined the party. And I think what you had is this digression or diversion or inflection point, what have you, in which on the one hand rhetoric against anti-government rhetoric increased, but you didn't see a similar decline in the role of government. And so I think what it created a situation became harder to do anything. Because the anti-government rhetoric was so dominant, and even suggesting that you were going to, expand healthcare access, for example, led to cries of socialism and cries of big government, even though most Americans, in reality, would benefit from that. So it's created, I think, in a lot of ways, this kind of treading water in this country when it comes to domestic policy of the last 30 or 40 years, in which we've kept a lot of the key elements of the New Deal and the Great Society and the welfare state that was created then, but have had a hard time expanding upon it because it's just become politically difficult, and because of that sort of anti-government rhetoric that became so dominant after '68.
And Ronald Reagan really epitomized that. I mean, he was a genius at using that anti-government rhetoric in a kind of, as we talked about before, in a kind of positive way.
I mean, it's true, and what's fascinating about Reagan is that no conservative was elected who had more of sort of an at least up to that point, anti-government rhetorical message, and yet as president, he didn't cut any programs. He actually preserved Social Security. He raised taxes repeatedly. The disconnect between what he said and what he did was pretty bad. And by the way, that's been true, I'd say, for every Republican politician since Reagan. It was true for George H.W. Bush. It was true for his son. It's true for Republicans in Congress. They certainly talk a big game about tricking government. They don't actually do it. And in fact, one of the ironies is that government has usually gotten bigger under Republican presidents and gotten smaller under Democrats, because Democrats think that the rhetoric of Republicans resonates, and they think that voters really do want you to cut the size of government. In reality, they don't really want it.
Right. Finally, Michael, talk a little bit about where you see the threads in all that we've been talking about that really continue to add to and are still adding to the real polarization in our political rhetoric.
One of the big takeaways in the book, and this wasn't what I thought when I first started working on the book, was the polarization that we've become so used to in American politics is really something that I think began in '68. Mm-hmm. Because on the one hand, you had the parties really moving more to the right and more on the Republican side and more to the left on the Democratic side. And the result of that is that when two parties move more to the extremes, it becomes harder to compromise. And I think that's definitely something that's happened in the last 20 years or so in this country. But I also think just the rhetoric, it's become much more delegitimizing, much more invalidating of political critics. And especially has to be said from Republicans. After '68, Nixon and Agnew very much picked up a lot of the really harsh rhetoric from Wallace. Some people like Agnew would go around the country basically calling Democrats unpatriotic and saying and attacking anti-war demonstrators and saying it would be okay to discard them like we discard rotten apples. So that kind of rhetoric, I think, became really sort of part of the political discussion in this country in a way that I think has really taken off in a bad way. And I think you see this now with Republicans and Hillary Clinton. They treat her like she's a criminal, like literally a criminal. They try to delegitimize her. And I think that it's very hard when you do that to then find ways after the elections to say, okay, let's work together. And so I think in a lot of ways, the rhetoric came out of '68, the messages, the extremism in the two parties has contributed to this polarization that we've become so used to today. And the sad part is there's no easy way to solve it, except for sort of like it's one party just becoming dominant. Which may happen this November with Democrats, considering the trajectory of the Trump campaign. But I definitely think that polarization that we've seen and that I don't see going away really is something that came out of '68 and I think has continued since '68 for almost 50 years.
Michael Cohen. Michael, I thank you so much for spending time with us today here on Radio Who, What, Why.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org bluecoalition.org/donate.